All right, I guess I will get started. There's a few things I'd like to cover with you today, and I'm hoping to get some time to show some of the work that comes out of this so that we can share what makes my work and job fun. And I will try and touch base with three issues that are currently hot topics for the faculty here, and those are about community outreach, technology, particularly in the new program, and of course this pressing concern around language, teaching, assessment, how we support students all the way from young children right up to our own PhD students. So this is an aesthetic approach, as it says, to the teaching of writing across the curriculum. I'm sort of taking a look at what the importance of writing is, especially in secondary education, where I have spent most of my time working here, helping to coordinate the programs that deliver language and literacy to secondary BEds. So what makes my work worthwhile? Well, first of all, the concept of teaching a nation of writers, which is an exciting idea to me, but I think is more poignant than it implies simply because today students who are going out into the world, whatever career they may be choosing, require that they be fluent, good writers. And that writing is taking a very predominant role, and that it's not just an elite set that run around and do the writing for the rest of us, but in fact, especially owing to developments with technology and what have you, everyone is required to master various writing skills. And so how do we work with education the way it is today in order to deliver those skills and capacities to our students in a responsible way? I think that's a real calling and a goal, something I proudly take part in. And as a part of that work, I find myself working with what I think is a great BEd program, and I love working with my colleagues and the idea that we can continue to improve that and continue to make it more and more relevant to students today in our schools. I think that's a really important role, and it's something that I think language and literacy has a particular meaning now, since our various skills that are required to make good writers require all kinds of different literacies, not just those related to print. So this is one of the things that I think we can make major forays into and help to address some of the changes and challenges to the field of working with language and literacy today. Those changes are whole-scale and sweeping. We see all kinds of different media through which people relate, and all sorts of different wonderful opportunities that come through engaging with those media, and also a number of pitfalls that occur when people don't understand the full range or possible problems that can arise in engaging with things like social media. And lastly, I'd like to point to this. It's something in which I think there's a real need for a lot of research, and that research needs to be addressed in an applied fashion. That we need applied theories, that we need to be able to actually address the how-to of delivering important skills and information in a media-dense, information-rich world. So the angle that I'm going to present to you today, and the one that I find myself trying to evolve through my work here, is the notion of a poetics of language and literacy, and in particular, a way of addressing poetics that is quite broad, so that the end result is not just poetry, but I'd like to look at this across a lot of genres and see poetry as both a mode of inquiry, but also a way to help to educate for other genres. So along the ideas of practice-based research model that I'm working on, I've been taking the concept of procedural poetics as a model to evolve the notion of writing across the curriculum. And so I will show you examples of where I'm drawing on different poetic practices to inform that research and action-based pedagogy. Along with that call to improve writing instruction is the need to also, I believe, improve aspects of writing assessment. It's one of the things that we see very slowly changing, and I mean very, very slowly, changing in the field. In 1971, Janet Emig wrote key work relating the compositional processes of 12th graders. And at the time, she was looking for any kind of information that would help to open the black box of what was going on when somebody was sitting down to actually do some writing. That largely the field has been dominated by a product-oriented mode of assessment. That is, we just took the paper, read it, and gave what she calls a quick impressionistic reading, and based on a quick impressionistic reading, ascribed some kind of value to it. That's okay, I suppose, especially when we consider in a public school context that somebody may have over 100 students and that it's hard to do in-depth analysis of each student's capacities within language. But if we really want to develop a rigorous sense of how to deliver important skills that students need to know to excel at all the various writing genres that they may need to address in their professional and daily lives, then we need better forms of assessment. And this is key, I think, to understanding how we can help somebody. So one of the keys to developing a better sense of how to deliver language and literacy curriculum is having a clearer sense of how to gauge what students need. No students that enter into classrooms, whether in primary or university, across the span, share exactly the same competencies when it comes to writing. We know that they all have fantastic imaginations, and that given some room and freedom and some background skills to play with, those imaginations can come to light. But until we overcome some of the basic fundamental difficulties that can be associated with learning a language, with learning specific forms of a language, and by that I would emphasize things like academic writing, writing in the different disciplines, each requires students to acquire specific vocabularies and specific ways of expressing their ideas that are acceptable within those disciplines. So one of the ideas here is that we need innovative language assessment to develop strategic writing practices that can be given to students to improve what they find themselves having difficulty with, to help to fill in the areas that they feel they may lack in terms of their knowledge of how to express things clearly within a given genre, and that they need to learn by doing. It's long been assimilated with the same product-oriented pedagogies of writing that students acquired most of their skill simply through reading. And that this correlation was basically seen as a one-to-one. If you read a whole lot of texts within a specific genre or way of expressing things, then you will acquire that, and game over. You can simply go and do it. I'm not sure that that's true, and I think that that's also what Janet Emig was trying to point out. So one of the ideas is, how do we get into what students need to know, and how do we deliver that to them? I'm going to step back for a moment and give a kind of broad overview to the field so that I can start to go more and more into the specifics of this and how it addresses it. This little semiotic overview is to present an idea of a well-balanced textual diet. The concept being that we have all these different spheres of influence in any act of writing that we have to do, any writing task, any kind of writing we're undertaking. That we need to understand how we fit within the writing task. We need to know our audience, whom we're writing to, and I would suggest that as an individual, we have a series of influences that are both from our own heritage and cultural backgrounds, as well as the communities we're a part of, and these influence our language learning from day one on. That we often speak within a society, and that we speak to others, and that writing is intended to address some kind of audience. Not to say that some very interesting writing is not done solely for yourself as audience, but that still posits part of you as your own audience and your own society, therefore. And that the ways that we govern these different writing practices, so the demands on the writer to meet expectations of this audience, are slowly accrued over time. They are sedimentary in the sense that language change happens rapidly within society. Some of those changes remain and solidify and become forms of genre convention. That is, we start to expect certain things when we read certain genres. Certainly we know this from a very broad scope, that if we were to look at a page that has a lot of line breaks in it, we might immediately assume, oh, that's a kind of poetry. It could, of course, with a few other key markers, turn into a recipe. If the page is unbroken continuous text and has lots of little brackets with people's name in it, then we might assume, oh, that's a kind of scientific or academic writing that's taking place. We would know that within each of those little genres, there are also subgenres and differentiations. For example, if you have a paper you are writing in which you tend to reference the researcher, you tend to be doing more of a popularized version of that, say, academic genre. If you tend to reference the published paper, not the researcher, then you tend to be heading more towards the traditional and culturally embedded version of the same genre, just as an example. Those are small distinctions, and one of the problems that we find with this black box is many of them, if not pretty much all of them, are not explicitly taught. You are expected to merely acquire this through reading, once again. Now, as I said, one of the problems with expecting students to merely acquire this knowledge through reading is that our information sources, particularly in the last 30 years, have diversified in an extreme way. They're also bringing around massive change. But if our primary sources are not governed by the legitimating processes of publication, then we have all different sources in which we may think we are getting an authoritative version of how this genre is communicated. So one of the things to do is to constantly be aware that this kind of a map, an overall map, is always at play. It's never even like this. We may have things that are much broader, have much greater sway in our personal writing, and it may depend on the writing task. So, as that little bit of analysis says, these things are constantly working with us when we're working on us, and we're working through them for every kind of writing task. Meaning, we have a lot of difficult considerations to make when we sit down at any stage of our lives, either in front of a computer or with pen and paper or what have you, and decide, okay, now I'm going to do some writing. That all these considerations need to come into play, and many of them are tacit rather than explicit. So now if I was to bring us to a few more of the details of what I'm talking about, I'm going to look at just two compositional sequences that bear relevance to anybody who's going to work in what I feel is education period, and especially anybody working in the field of secondary education. Because in all forms of education, all the way through our subjects, we expect students to write, to demonstrate some aspects of the knowledge they're acquiring. And if we think of a text very broadly, which I'm hoping to do, to think of a text as a movie or a book or a website or even the play-by-play of a football game or something like that. We might see that we have to navigate a number of these different challenges every time we sit down to write. That we have what we might consider the language stock we have to work with. And of course this again changes from person to person. The breadth of the vocabulary at one's disposal, the comfort one has working in different kinds of language constructions. And then The extension into the register. Register is a term I'm borrowing primarily from systemic functional linguistics here, but it is the nature of the interrelationships between the individuals being addressed. Clearly, if one is writing to a boss, they might change the way they express something if they are writing to their kid sister. This notion of register shift is really important, especially when students are coming from cultures outside of the mainstream, so that then they have to adjust and understand how to make those appropriate register shifts given the audience for their writing task. As one little example, I'm going to try and, as I say, put a few examples into this as we go. I'll maybe pull up one of our, let's see. Okay. Here's just an entertaining example by one of our recent students of register shift using their UBC admission letter. An admission letter is a good example, as I often mention, of a formal genre. It's intended to be giving a clear, though distant, version of how to express yourself in a formal fashion. So here, a student has taken, I don't think it matters, the student has cleared this for public use. The student uses this and then starts to go through the process of understanding, well, how do I register shift down? So one of the keys that we would look at, for example, would be the use of things like phrasal verbs. Throw up instead of vomit, that kind of thing. We have these distinctions in our language use that are purposeful and allow us entry into specific kinds of aesthetic communities. And if the community we want to get involved in is going to relate to kind of hip and colloquial exchange, then it embodies a certain kind of writing practice. If it is going to be an institutional exchange, another one. So this is just to share a kind of practice that I use in some of my writing classes to give us this idea of, all right, how do we go about shifting? And let's look at what we think we are going to shift in any given text if we're addressing a different kind of audience. The key to this kind of practice is not only to do it in one way, but to do it in the other. It's often one of the best versions of text or text types to use to go the other direction is to take advertising. And one might see that a lot of the advertising attempts to relate to you on a very informal, friendly, and somewhat, colloquial basis. It's supposed to make you feel comfortable with the product, not to awe-strike you with its profundity. It doesn't want to do that. It wants to just sell it to you. So you could take, and when you look at this version, if you get a little bit of the texture, to play with that pun, a texture of it, you see it has a little bit more of a ring of typical advertising when you see it through that lens, through a colloquial lens. Then, of course, we have the issue of genre, and I will go a little bit more in depth into genre in a moment. But we also have the notion of style, and style is another issue in which we are confronting a lot of change in practices, particularly, again, given to the idea that style is often now determined by shorter and shorter written expression. We see things like Facebook updates and tweets suddenly making it into the daily papers, and so we see the sedimenting of particular genre practices, and in this case, the shrinking of the overall textual output that determines kinds of styles. The other aspect of this is that we're also in a model, having shifted away from a typical published version where authority is established through the mechanisms of publication, where in some ways our styles are losing the aspect where the author is the most central feature to relate to. This is not, of course, new. It's part of a postmodern turn or post-structuralism. But I think it's becoming more and more apparent that there is a quasi-anonymity that writers exist within that's shifting. It's not the nom de plume version of anonymity, but that a lot of things can be done and put out there, a lot of writing practices that don't necessarily bear the name of the author. And then again, we might work with texts, change them, and go through what is commonly referred to now as remix culture, in which you are taking all sorts of authors and combining them through various mashup practices into something wholly new that is not the original intent of the author, nor is that the point, to extend from the author's work, but rather to bring a lot of authors together and make something new out of their work. So the notion of style itself is another area where we're seeing massive shift in the field. Mode and media. Mode and media is important in this particular sequence because, as I say, our texts themselves are diversifying. We don't now assume that if you are writing a commentary on a movie, you are going to write it and then publish it in a column. It may be that you create a video and you put it on your vlog or video blog, and that becomes a form of feedback and interactive response. If that's the case, then some aspects of the publishing environment in which that takes place are also going to determine some of the thought that goes into the writing practice. So if I'm writing for a column in a newspaper, I might write something significantly different than if I'm making some notes, turning on a video camera, and improvising in front of the camera based on a few notes. So the idea of mode, and mode I'm using to distinguish it, sometimes we are also doing this in a performative fashion. We may be finding a wide variety of, we might be hearing compositions that express, like a musical composition that expresses these ideas, dance, physical movement, performance. One of the areas that I'll get into in a moment, ideas of when poetry is seen as a performance or a slam or some of these different modes. These too greatly influence the kinds of poems that people might bring to a performative environment. From experience, there are some poems that I write which are really meant for a page. They're meant for a reader. They're full of different kinds of wordplay that if I read the poem at the speed at which I'm now speaking, you really likely would catch very little of that wordplay. It's meant for a reader to be able to review, look at, repeat. But there are certain poems that I'd write that are absolutely meant to be publicly performed. They have a rhetorical bent. They are intended to agitate or make people think or whatever. And so we can see how the distinction between the mode in which we are addressing our eventual audience plays a big role in the entire writing task. And that as writing teachers, and I mean writing across the curriculum, some of these considerations also need to come into play. And finally, to the level of discourse. And in discourse, I mean the broad general ways in which our work, once it's made public, enters, deals with themes, deals with hot topics of the day, and also enters into a general public discussion in which others can then give feedback, and how we share in that process to develop a larger discussion among our society. These things as well are changing. The second of these two just looks at the evolution out of Emig's work, and not just Janet Emig, of course. I can mention a lot of different people. But the idea that one does not simply sit down in the way that we do in our high-stakes testing environments. One does not usually just sit down, get presented with a question, and told to write for whatever, an hour, and then fold up the paper and hand it in. That this kind of really artificial and school-only writing task is seen as almost an anomaly, and enforces this notion that the only thing of importance in any writing act is the final product. What Emig was finding through her work was that there are all kinds of different stages along which writing evolves before it necessarily has to go and encounter its public dimension. Because there was this emphasis on the product-only approach, we tended then to just look at that and gauge that and ignore all the other stages. So I might ask, for example, among the people here, if you reflect back on your own time in schooling, were you ever taught how to edit your own writing? Were you ever taught what to take out? Did they say replace weak verbs with strong ones? And then, of course, you're tortured at going, what the heck is a weak verb? Why is it so weak? What can we do to build up its aerobic capacity so that it turns into a strong verb? And you were taught how to edit. Who taught you?
An English teacher in high school.
An English teacher in high school?
Yeah.
So you're one of the few.
Yeah, and when you use a gerund or an ing versus an infinitive.
Infinitive.
I remember because I was kind of the same thing. What makes it better to
Right.
do it this way than that way?
Yeah.
That wasn't always necessarily explained, but I remember the process of the learning to edit and the red circles around and underlining and doing it for each period.
Right. You encountered the great awk! Along with the frag and all other kinds of very...
And I remember not being taught it, but realizing it needed to be taught and being quite frustrated that it wasn't.
I think that was my feeling as well, that largely it's an unguided process. It's anticipated that it's all tacit. That is especially... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was taught to use active verbs rather than passive verbs in gym.
And in fact, taught to, and you'll see this with Microsoft Word today, taught to use active instead of passive aspects of a sentence, which is one of those astounding generalizations that we see going on today, when in much of scholarly and scientific writing, the passive is essential because you want to continue with the given information and you don't want to structure your sentence in such a way that it always has to have a subject rather than the previous given as its subject. So this is just to suggest that along this continuum here, we see a lot of these stages that are omitted. And I think that to some degree, one of the ways that we can really bolster education, especially in a secondary context, but I again would assert it's relevant across ages, is that we need to see more of these different parts of the sequence elucidated in a way that people can start to understand how to approach them and see their own writing within that same continuum, not panicking if the first thing they've done isn't the best thing they've ever done. So this becomes kind of key, and of course we'll also take a good look at the importance of publishing work. And because the notion of publication has shifted so dramatically, and that it's possible now for people to publish work in all kinds of different media with relative ease. Compared to, say, 50 years ago, publication is a no-brainer by now. And to just make this clear, the reason that I'm in my little abstract for this particular talk, there's another genre, the abstract, be interesting to study. I'm talking about the idea of using constrained poetics. And the idea of constraint here is the idea that we can set a series of rules by which somebody would practice a piece of writing. They can be quite simple. And that in practicing those, what they will generate is usually something that comes off as poetry. But what they're doing is acquiring a specific skill that they can then apply in other genres. Let's take another just quick example for the fun of it. A lot of time is spent pretty much through middle school and secondary school in English classes, as in others, and trying to get people to write a good paragraph. The paragraph, as it's come to us through pedagogical convention, involves a topic sentence. One is always told, especially for the opening of an essay, that one needs a really good hook or clinching topic sentence. And then they are left to go and dream up whatever that is. We have to, of course, consider that when that is coming from Marx, it is often an essay being written in school, and this again is a result of the technological innovations. We worry that every time we send an essay home with students, it will be either plagiarized or be done by a tutor. I hear this complaint constantly among the teachers I work with. So how do we teach it? Well, one of the things I try to get my students to do, just to pick up on a point made earlier, is to see, well, let's take a look. What happens if you were to start your topic sentence with a gerund? The texture of the piece of writing you develop out of that is one in which the reader lands in medias res, so to speak. They land running. They are in the active form of an idea. However, if one wanted to start with a much more abstract and austere one, you can employ an infinitive. To start to generate a series of sentences that might be interesting starts to paper using a series of language constraints like it must start with a gerund. Any gerund, but it must start with a gerund. You will actually in the end produce an interesting piece of writing. Maybe it's time for more. Well, let's keep going for 1 second. Let's take a quick little look at this, and then hopefully we'll get to the fun stuff. So calculating genre. I think what we need to do is to do some pretty serious analysis of what goes on in different writing tasks so that those writing tasks what's required of students can be made explicit. As fluent readers, we tend to have buried most of that knowledge so that it's a part of our unconscious understanding. We recognize genre markers right away, and we don't need them explicitly stated. We wouldn't think twice if we wanted to look for where something is in a book to look to the table of contents. That seems to be a given. But in many ways, these are still riding on conventions that remain tacit, that we don't explore really explicitly. So one of the ideas that I've been thinking of is, how can I bring together a number of fields to look at this and explore the ideas of genre and what is required by students to excel in the various kinds of writing tasks they face by combining avant-garde art practices. And when I say that, I'm going to lean specifically into a group of French mathematicians turned writers and their work, Oulipo, which is the idea of the opportunity of potential literature that faces us, the oeuvre of potential literature, so looking at what all the possibilities for literature are. And what they did was decide to apply mathematical principles to the creation of literature. They provided constraints, some of which may seem utterly pointless. Some more popular works would be like a novel that lacks entirely the letter E in the form of what is known as a lipogram. To that end, it might seem entirely pointless, but hey, there is a fellow colleague and scholar in the University of Calgary, Christian Bach, a Canadian poet who currently holds record for a best-selling book of Canadian poems, in which every poem is kind of a reverse lipogram. It uses only one vowel. So whole poems comprised in which the only vowel that appears is E, and then on to A, I, O, U. So there you go. It has a certain kind of popular appeal. I was wondering if it wasn't just with ESL teachers who wanted to practice vowel pronunciation, but who knows? There's a lot of those, so maybe that could boost your sales. Just ideas for the poets in the room. Some of this is borrowing from aspects of genre theory and applied in systemic functional linguistics. Here we go then, putting it into practice. The methods, as I've just been saying, the idea would be to focus on specific things that students need. Again, this requires good assessment, and we need methods that allow us to assess what students are doing. So rather than the typical form of assessment of writing, which tends to be that same red pen circling thing, it has a pejorative tone to it. Has a pejorative tone. So we tend to not recognize what students are doing. We tend to recognize how they're breaking with specific conventions. There has been some very interesting work, I think, anyway, done in the 90s, in which they looked at feedback on student papers over a period of time, and this is in a university context, and they discovered that they were getting contradictory feedback half the time. One of the problems with conventions. If the conventions that we are busy using to do such kinds of assessment are based on native speaker bias, that is, this is the way we say it because I was born into this language culture and therefore I know, we will find many, many instances in which the rule itself seems weak, a flibberty-gibbet of a rule. So one of the ideas is we need to be able to see what students are doing, what they're doing well, and then to note what aspects are missing from their writing. And to do it in a context-sensitive fashion means to also appreciate how these rules shift depending on the genre of writing being done. So when we take those into account, we know what kinds of features we expect to see within a given text that fits within a given genre and a given register, i.e. to its audience. And when we note what is missing, then the idea is to create strategic writing prompts that allow the students to practice that in a way that the practicing of it is not done through close exercises, as has been done, but through the form of language games. The result of these games, I feel, is some of the most interesting poetry I get to see. It's exciting. It breeds all kinds of wonderful imaginative realms for us to play with, and the student can have a lot of pleasure and a lot of benefit from doing these kinds of work, especially when they find that the exercise they did to learn to write a good topic sentence winds up being a published poem. So finally, the idea here is, as I think I've already addressed this, simply the fact that the relationship is quite close. So sometimes when I talk about procedural poetics, people think I'm solely talking to poets. And I don't think so. What I'm arguing for is that I would like to see a lot more understanding of how poetry teaches language to writers. And that benefiting from following procedural poetics, that is, following sort of guidelines for what you're going to do as a writer and then filling into that form whatever content appears to you at the time, that you actually develop the kinds of skills necessary to conduct all kinds of other writing tasks, essays or scientific reports or journal articles or what have you. So I'm going to just show, hard to read. I'm going to just show a few little examples. This is the work of Marcel Benabou in his work Rule and Constraint. He's developing this off work done by Raymond Queneau, another very important member of the Oulipo movement. In this, they're breaking down three basic areas, and we're going to see a matrix of them in a moment, and I hope you'll see how this applies to what I'm talking about. We're thinking about here an inner circle of linguistic objects, which go from smallest to greatest, and they could go much greater, as he often says. But if we think that we can constrain aspects of what we're doing down to the phoneme, and so let me give another example that might help. In working with ESL students, both as a teacher and a tutor and all sorts of different capacities, I've found they get the best bang for their buck, in a tutoring sense, out of one quick suggestion. We often think of something like alliteration, and I'm sure you know what alliteration is. Alliteration is when you start a series of words with the same sound. Usually it's a consonant. I often tell them as a starting place, one time in a paragraph, use an example of alliteration. In each paragraph, one would think, hey, what is that? Easy to do, whatever, it's a little bit of word choice. Strangely enough, the papers start coming back with much better marks. Students get wildly excited by this. Why? Because it's not just that suddenly you're seeing a kind of sophisticated play. What's happening is that many people, when acquiring writing, especially coming to writing tasks from another language and cultural background, see writing. They write visually. They don't hear it. Often that's because there's translation going on in the head, but they don't clearly hear what is being written down on the page. As soon as you get them to constrain their writing with this one simple little constraint, just to one sentence in a paragraph, all of a sudden they make this turn, and what they write, they hear. They understand the importance of sounding out your meaning as well as just graphing out your meaning. It has this stunning reward value for the student, primarily. I mean, ultimately for the teacher or tutor as well, but for the student, so that they start to perceive language differently. And by presenting something which sounds good, the reader doing the quick impressionistic reading goes, oh. They don't even necessarily notice, oh, look at that alliteration. They just get this feel, oh, that's a nice sentence. I'm going to keep reading. I'm having a better time with this paper all of a sudden. So this is just one little, almost throwaway kind of example of how you can constrain even the smallest aspects of language, that is the letter or the phoneme, and wind up with excellent pedagogical results. You will see then that it goes up to the syllable and the word and the syntagm, and I will also present a bit of a focus in a moment on why I think phrasal analysis is key, especially when we are trying to assess students' capacities and fluencies. But then up to the sentence, the paragraph, the page, of course, we could go on. We could go to the level of the whole composition, the book. There's no reason that constraints can't be, or the web page, or whatever. That all kinds of constraints come with these different forms, but that we can also teach through that idea of constraints. So I'm just going to move fairly quickly, and we won't have a lot of time to go through this, but I'm just going to try and present a couple little ideas that you can maybe use to reflect on what I'm saying. Here, we get a series of operations. The operations, it's probably obvious, are, because this is Oulipo, are being borrowed from mathematics. Well, the reason I want to bring this up, it's hard to see. Okay, I know, I'm sorry, bad photocopy. I'll say some of them so that we can make that more clear. And hopefully we can post the PowerPoint. The operations, which go like this: displacement, substitution, addition, subtraction, multiplication, in brackets repetition, division, deduction, contraction, you'll see come from mathematics. But if we could go back to our issue of editing, these are all key operations that you also use in editing. You have to decide what needs to be added for clarity, what needs to be gotten rid of because it's redundant, what you need to elaborate further because it's not fully there, etc., etc. So you can see then that these act as processes or procedures that one can do not only to generate the text, but to improve the text. And that down here, once again, we have this range of linguistic objects. What they've done is put examples of common kinds of games as well as Oulipian practices. So here we get anagrams, palindromes, Pig Latin, and metathesis from the idea of displacement of letters. Typical games. Here, of course, if we're working with students and we want to develop something, let's take another example at the level of the phoneme or the letter. When teaching students, say, of a Korean background. Koreans will typically have problems with P's and F's. And there's all kinds of instances in which those kinds of non-distinction, they're not marked phonetically for the listener. And we also see this with Spanish speakers and B and V, for example. So there's ways that you can practice certain kinds of language games using simple constraints around what words are used that help the reader, especially if they wind up in a modal performance of it, to develop an acuteness of hearing that will help them to make those distinctions that are invaluable if you're trying to succeed in an English-speaking environment and there's some of your phonemes that you're not hearing because they were never distinctly marked as you were growing up and acquiring your language. So anyway, here's a whole list of them. I'll show you, it continues one more page. So that we get all the way here to paragraph, and as I said, this could continue on to larger and larger portions of a composition, whatever that happens to be. So here, just to give us a kind of broad understanding of how we're correlating, in a sense, the constraint, hi Natasha, the constraint, where that constraint is applied, and of course they can be applied across all these different things. You can constrain the phoneme and the letter and the word, okay, and the phrase, or the syntagm as they use, to generate a piece of writing. Students then have one major benefit. One of the real problems for the student writer is that you sit down and you're expected to pump out a work of a masterpiece of genius off the top of your head, and the typical expression is that you wind up with writer's block. It places an inordinate pressure on the student to become an instant authority or a master of writing. So the idea here is that we need a lot more time playing and developing some of those skills, and that a lot of time could be spent fruitfully in simply working at different levels of constraint and filling them with form. Then the game is, how do I find things that fit this form and make meaning to me personally? I'm not expected to suddenly come up with the masterwork. Fact is you'll probably wind up with something you like better anyway than if you just have to sit down and generate it off the top of your head, especially when learning. Here's a bit of repetition for some people that maybe know my work. For a long time, I've been trying to develop a specific method of assessing students. My method assessing student writing. My method really focuses on phrasal analysis, and that's because at the level of the phrase, we actually are in the position of making meaningful expression. That doesn't mean you can't have a one-word phrase, wow, which is, of course, a meaningful expression. But this is a way to cluster language into quickly recognizable chunks. Why is that important? Because sometimes we need to be able to assess writing quickly simply by the demands of time and the amount of work we have to do. What's key to this, and we're only, of course, seeing little bits of this, I do try and teach this to students, so I try not to encumber them. Sometimes we panic when we see the word or hear the word grammar. There's I'm sure a period of time when grammar was universally taught. I often find students that sometimes in order to get into like the B.Ed secondary English program, they have to go and do a grammar course. The amazing thing is how many of them come back to me saying, I hated when I had to go and do that, when I was told to do that. I've never taken a course that helped me so much. I would testify that the same applies to me. So this is just a way. What I would like to point out is this along the side. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of this and go down to here. And it's what I would call stratal phrasal, meaning we're not just talking about phrasal analysis, but we're talking about a strata. The strata are basically which of these phrases occur in which kind of genres with the most frequency. It's a way that we can start looking at language and breaking it down according to kinds of register. So again, as I gave you the example earlier of shifting register in the B.Ed admission letter, one of the things that was done was to suddenly embody a lot more phrasal verbs. Here we see a clear way that you can register shift. It's very, very unusual unless there are a phrasal or prepositional verb within the domain that is being written in. In other words, if you are in social studies, you might have specific phrasal verbs that get used a lot. But in most formal or academic writing, there's a real absence of those features. Of course, once students start to acquire those, they tend to use them in any writing scenario. And this has the effect on the reader of making them think they don't understand what the demands of the genre are. All of these things, of course, relate to a series of different ideas of how those function in terms of fluent writing, that they may add to the concept of description, and we have certain genres which have a lot of description. They may build your vocabulary, they may add cohesion, and what have you. All right. So now I hope to show you some interesting stuff. What is this? Changes to the field. Really what this is just to say that I think this work is becoming more and more important, and it's becoming more important primarily because we are seeing a massive change not only at the level of language through what is used, and a typical example to use is the idea of text language. You know, the idea of see you later spelled C and U and L8R. So just to give an example of language change at the level of the letter, or phoneme in that case. So this is just to say that I think what we really do need to some degree is to see that print is still key. We still need to work with print a lot, but that we have a whole bunch of other influences in every kind of writing task we undertake. That students need the opportunities to work, write, and think across media, and that they need to consider where the writing task is going. We all know that the problem with school-only writing is that it's deemed to have one audience member, that is a teacher. The teacher writes a bunch of feedback, student gets a paper back, looks at the mark, throws the paper in the garbage. So we need the opportunity to write, work, and think, and develop feedback that bridge our physical modes of expression, the material we use in that expression, pen and paper, paint and paper, what have you, and our virtual or digital modes of expression. To do that, we need course delivery systems that enhance our ability to share multimedia work. And very briefly, I'll present this to you. So the website that I was demonstrating a moment ago, here, this is a website that I developed through a grant with Dr. Teresa Rogers and myself in order to try and find ways that we could develop a more fluid mode of feedback, a mode of feedback that could encompass ideas of video exchange between people, where we could post files that were audio files or PowerPoints or movies and what have you, and develop ways that we then interact with our audiences. We can come to an understanding of what those media do for us as writers, and also the detriments or challenges they present. And I think we have lots of examples, especially in pop culture, of where a lack of understanding of that is being demonstrated. Perhaps, not to call any moral judgment on it, but we saw a very key example around the issue of the Stanley Cup riot. We saw some younger people involved in that run home and post on their Facebook pages pictures of themselves, with the idea that somehow this would, I don't know, vanish into the ether. That this notion of authorial ambiguity, say, or anonymity, was going to protect them, without realizing that the nature of this media is that you are making your personal life public. We've also noticed that there's other difficulties. I remember it wasn't long ago we had a principal in Hope, I believe, whose wife had posted a picture that looked like, a silhouette of him looked like he might have been without clothes on a beach, and suddenly he's being told to resign. Pitfalls. Doesn't seem that offensive maybe, but you can get in a lot of trouble. Okay, so one of the keys here is how do you develop the kinds of course delivery systems that will allow you to write across a lot of media and to interact? And how do you then build that into the kinds of projects you want your students to do, especially when publishing? Now, my partner happens to work for Plenty of Fish, which is a big online dating site. And so the next thing I'm going to show you is based on, yay, music, is based on some of work I did with a fellow who is currently one of our students. And I think this is just a beautiful work that explores a lot of the different dynamics that I'm discussing. It's about feedback, it's about poetry, it's about audience, it's about register, it's about the dynamics of genre within various digital modalities. Thought I would take a little of your time to share this with you. Ooh. I like a poem that ends with ha 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 ha. Oh, there you go. Very funny. He's going to go on and give you the details of him doing it while he's in action. I just find this kind of a delightful bit of fun to have, playing with the concept of social networks and helping us to both spread the good gospel of poetry at the same time. There you are. Poets write. He tells a very funny story, of course, about the fact that as another kind of gender-based dynamic, when he first went on and put his own picture up, he was there for a whole week, and didn't have one single person write to him. And as soon as he put the picture of himself up, as you saw it there, within 5 minutes he had about 10 people. Within about half an hour he was dealing with 30 different correspondents almost instantly. So there you go, plenty of fish in action. So just to give a sense of, maybe thinking here about how we do think educationally about the different digital spaces in which people perform their writing and exist as writers and learn and acquire and change their lives. And that all of these, I think, are part of the new field in which writing is taking place and need to be incorporated not only into the practices of learning formal writing practices and the demands of, scholarly or scientific writing, but also then the demands of just daily life and the writing tasks that we engage with, and I think what to expect and how to do it well, and also what to be aware of and avoid. So I think maybe I'll leave it at that for now. There's lots more I'd like to show you because, I think one of the things, if I was to say that I love most about my job, it's that I get to really enjoy an aspect of not only what my students produce, their work is always astounding and amazing to me for where they go when they feel they have the freedom to really explore, when they're not expected to come up with a work of genius in staid format that they feel is unfamiliar with, but rather are just given the right to go and explore, play games, and find ways to make it public. They inevitably do a lot of learning. In the level of community outreach, I'd add that a group of students that I've worked with over the past 2 years have now started their own writers collective. They perform in and around Vancouver, are heading over to do the Gabriola Island Poetry Festival in a moment. They are doing a reading that I'm going to promote to you, since I'll go and read some poetry with them, at Jean Cafe on January 27th. Coming up soon. The death concept is relating to the fact that 2 of their members are on the way off to teach internationally, so it's a bit of a farewell to 2 of the members. What's key is all the people in this group, that is some 14 strong right now, are all teachers. And so I would go to the very basic premise that I'm borrowing from Carl, I believe, which is that teachers who write make better writing teachers. And that learning through these models of playing with language really does teach you a lot about how language works. Okay, and I'll leave it at that. Any questions I can take? Now that I've done my little pitch and promo, I feel okay.
Yeah, I have a question. I have to go to another appointment, so if I rush out after this,
We'll take it
you'll
first.
understand. I really appreciate your emphasis on process and poetics and aesthetics. I think those are really important. And the way you talk about the importance of feedback, I think that's really, really great. I have one kind of theoretical question, and I'm not sure if it applies, but you certainly started off with the metaphor of the black box. The black box in writing, can we somehow get inside that? Which of course is a behaviorist metaphor. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of conflict or between that and the more aesthetic, process-oriented kind of approach that you take. If you start with that, aren't you somehow limiting the other aspect of what you're doing?
That's good. And at the first time, I think I've been asked to really seriously consider that metaphor. I always think of it as planes. The missing information that goes down with the plane that they're always trying to rescue. When the crash has happened, all the trouble has happened, and now we want to know what process went on while the whole thing was sinking. Which is, I think, where I'm plucking that, because I'm thinking to myself, what we tend to look at is the final product paper. It gets all its red pen marks, it gets its evaluation and turned back, and that there's no sense that we've actually understood what the writer is doing, what challenges they're facing, what they're actually achieving in the paper that we're saying is got too many fragmentary sentences or what have you. So from a theoretical angle, I see what you're saying, that it has this, I don't know, a kind of idea that there's a mechanism within the box, and that all we need to do is to put the cogs in the right place and it will function perfectly. And I don't think that's what I mean. I think what I mean is the hidden or tacit information that tends to be occluded from the quick impressionistic reading that most writing gets. And so if we want to actually help people become competent writers, we need to know some of those stages along the process of where we can assist them. That's the idea of the strategic writing prompt. You can do this by just applying it. You know, take some writing games, apply it generally. But I found it to be especially useful when you go, this person is struggling to do this task. Let me give them X kind of a game. And that's what I mean is in the black box. For the most part, we don't know what the struggling writer is working on, right? And if they get critiqued on it several times, they simply back off and take a safer route.
So as you say, it's an organic process, not a mechanistic.
Yes, yeah. So you're right. I mean, on that level, I should be, of all people, I should be careful with my metaphors. I kept thinking of the plane going down. Yeah. Or at least it wasn't. I didn't say the Skinner box of writing, because then it's a little like that, though. You know, I've tried writing where I keep waiting for the pellet to drop, and it never does. Anyway.
Yeah, as opposed to Skinner's black box, because actually Skinner's the one who really popularized the concept. There's Tolman's think aloud technique, which is much more phenomenological, cognitive. Are there any works that you would particularly recommend where people have used think aloud about the whole compositional process? Like even in the French schools, they have done quite a bit on think aloud and phenomenological.
And I think also following out of Janet Enoch, because that's how she does, and not to say Janet Giltro as well does a lot based on think alouds. But her work was, she introduces that formidable work in the world of process writing by saying, where can we go to find out what people do when they want to compose something? She goes, well, we could look at writers, but they're notorious liars, and they change what they do from moment to moment. And then she goes, we could talk to editors, but editors only really get to a deep understanding of the one or two people's processes, so that's not going to give us general information. And then she goes, we could look at rhetoric books, but that's stuck within a very particular frame. And then she goes, in the end, the only thing that makes sense is to sit down beside, in this case, students in their 12th grade, and have them think aloud, go, oh, now I'm trying to figure out how to express this idea, and here's the way. And the only problem that she admits as well is that you've also got an interpersonal dynamic messing with what is really going on, the pressure to say something, I don't know, sophisticated, interesting to your interlocutor, to also, some people work inside. Some people also tend to write and they don't want, I often find a key distinction. Some people, if they tell you what they're going to write, they have a superstition that they will never write it. Because they lose some of the driving force to get that out into the world. It's been gotten out and it had its audience, it's had its day, I'm moving on. Other people, of course, don't. They love to plan and think and talk and share.
That's a big theme among writers too, that if you talk about it, you'll lose it, right?
Yeah. And so maybe there are those challenges that I think also attend to think aloud, but I think the think aloud is an interesting way to inquire and make comparison with your own technique, see how it's working for students. Over a long period of time, you may be able to make some generalizations. My question is that I think you can make generalizations at the base of, on the basis of genre convention, and to some degree on the basis of language function. But I'm not sure that we can make them on the basis of individual perception of engagement with language.
It's been around for over a century, and it's gone in and out of favor. It was really popular in the 1880s, and then it sort of went out of favor. And because there's lots of problems, as you say, as soon as you think about it, you destroy what's happening, you know? It's
Right.
not that easy. It's like trying to do inobtrusive measurement, you know?
Right.
Very difficult.
Right. Yes, it's got a quantum effect. So given that it's got this quantum effect, now we have to go for inside Skinner's black box is Schrodinger's cat, right? So
That'd be a good article.
yeah, that's right. I keep writing and all that comes out is meow.
Meow would be good. Lots of potential.
Lots of potential. So I just saw last night David Cronenberg's new film, A Dangerous Method, which is the story of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud.
Oh, yeah.
And Freud, of course, among poets, is perhaps most famous for saying something like, poets had discovered the unconscious long before I came along, but I gave it a scientific method. So for Freud, everything was about scientific method, always wanting to explain in the ways of science. And of course, I found quite offensive much of Carl Jung's notion of mysticism, or shamanism as he called it, and the spiritual. And certainly Freud was very much a professed atheist, a Jewish by birth and atheist by conviction. So I'm always interested in the differences between the professed scientific approach and the approach that acknowledges the possibility that fairies exist in meadows, in places where there are forests and rocks and so on. And because on the one hand, you've got that which seems to have a certain kind of rigor about it, and on the other, you've got that which seems quite fanciful, quite full of a sense of wonder that might be going somewhere, but most likely isn't going anywhere at all. Which is the lovely idea that, you know, that maybe we're just enjoying all there is to enjoy, and this is it. You know, this is lovely, and it doesn't need more explanation. But in the academy, we always want to explain everything. We want to name it, categorize it, and in fact, maybe we end up just losing much of the energy that is the energy of the moment. So meow.
So meow, yeah. The cat's cradle, as they say. I hear you. I think that finding the freedom to work from a space of wonder might also be a challenge. That we don't enter with no fetters. We tend to enter with every chain attached. And that it's part of a discipline, whether we want to use that term or not, it's part of a discipline to escape those fetters and then to allow things to simply exist, be spontaneous, respond to any number of given stimuli instead of narrowing the window, the possible, into a very, into a very focused idea of this is what I have to do or this is what is expected, and to deal with all those kinds of, again, psychological, given Freud, those kinds of psychological negotiations. Because I would say this, that, and it's a little tangential, but in pursuing practices in which I'm following a procedure, it does have this strange interface with aspects of psychoanalysis. This is especially true of, I also like to work in visual arts. I produce various kinds of images. Take me hundreds of hours, unfortunately. But is really free form, but I follow a very strict procedure as I'm doing it. I have no idea where I'm going. That's why I love doing it, because it's this thing where I discover entirely. I don't feel I'm driving the process. I feel it's teaching me. Inevitably, at some stage, far into that creative process, I start to look at this thing and go, my God, it's like it's the story of the last 2 months of my life. I see all these things showing up that seem to reflect my inner state of whatever, whatever turmoils, whatever worries, whatever strengths and happinesses, they all seem to get involved. It is like a diorama of my psychoanalytic state of mind. And it's not intentional. I'm not, so there's this aspect in which I reflect on that notion that Freud wanted to go to your dreams as the key source of your think aloud in order to reap the information that was cleared of your, I must act like this in this situation, just to get to what that was. And so the visual art allows the same thing. And I think I'm saying that because to some degree, when you stop the pretense of authorship and allow something to be the practice of a writing game, and you're filling content into a form, which seems nothing could, you're not asked, this is not about you writing the world's greatest stuff. Then in doing that act and just finding words, just playing around and mixing them up, that so many times, I get this from my students when they're doing it, so many times the response is, this is really deep and insightful about me, and I'm not sure how that happened. And I was like, thinking to myself, it's almost inevitable. It's almost inevitable, because when faced with a bunch of choices in which you're not having them predetermined for you, other than this is the kind of thing which fits here, you are going to affiliate or assimilate with that which has the most relevance to you in the moment, sounds that it resonates the most in that moment. And so sure, it's like, Rorschach inkblot.
So
Now we've got who? Freud, Jung, Rorschach. I know, that's actually not where I was going at all with this, but I did say cultural theory was involved, so we can call that cultural theory.
Going back to your black box, one of the things I thought it was, I think it's John Locke, tableau noir, the way that you're offering new students that blank slate to be creative. And then I'm wondering, in that action, or even bigger, your career, do you find yourself wandering lonely as a cloud among your colleagues because you're working so diligently at breaking the status quo?
Well, yes. I certainly have my Wordsworthian adventures where I am floating lonely as a cloud.
Or being ostracized, or feeling as though, let's soften it up a little bit.
I do think, if I can answer you in a very circumlocuting fashion, I do think that there's a need to do that. The kind of work I'm talking about warrants forms of research. And that it's hard to argue that point insofar as it is understood. Because there tends to be this bias that as soon as something suggests that you acquire through play, or that you're talking about poetry, and any one of these things, I'm talking to the converted here, but that you are arguing for something that most people don't recognize as having any proper systemic value. And my thinking is that that's probably where the most important breakthroughs come, as through what is deemed as not being of particular value. And so I'm encouraged by that thought, if at times I do find myself, wandering, lonely as a cloud, daffodils, 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 daffodils. But of course, I get to spend a good portion of my time dealing with literature I love. So on that level, I find myself absolutely blessed and wouldn't change a thing. So, yes.
Maybe related, in our villages, the priest of the villages died, and they want to hire a new priest. And the two persons applying for the job, one is them is very qualified, and the second one, he was illiterate, cannot read and write. And the leader of the village say, we are going to hire one of you, just please, the exam was just write the word snake. And the first one he said write snake, S-I-N-K-E, and the second one he just draw a snake on the sand. And he said, you pass and you fail. And he asked the villages, the people of the village, who is the right? He said, this is a snake or this is a snake? He said, no, this is a real snake when he draws the snake.
Oh, so the drawing won, as opposed to the...
And the one with the education, he failed.
There you go. First of all, yes, I think that's an interesting testament to the power of multimodality today. You know, it's also making me think that Freud has crept back into the discussion yet again, and I don't know. I didn't set off to make this about Freud, but there you go, Carl. Yes, Christy.
Dr. James, if we have time and if you like, might you tell us a poem?
I could, but I don't have any with me. And I think I've taken the opportunity to share my joy of my students' work, simply because I would rather you came to the reading, where of course you can enjoy both mine and my students' work. I brought some, so here, you take one. Starts at doors at 7, starts at 8. Although I can always improvise poetry for you. I can stand out in the hall and yell it.
Can I ask a question first?
Yes, that's a good idea. You got the sequence down pat.
Thank you for doing this work and for talking about it the way you have. I heard you say earlier that you felt, you identified some of the problems of having people judge language based on their native speaker status. This is how I've learned it. It just feels right this way. I was wondering whether you feel that language then has its own kind of innate authority that is true to itself, or whether people are somehow the custodians of language, that there is some authority in saying this is what feels right, or are there rules that simply are rules?
A great and enormously broad question. First of all, I don't think language, some languages are dead, but living languages don't exist without a form of social that takes place. There is no autonomous space in which a set of rules can simply provide you with language, and that language operates like that. Even in our artificial languages, the ones that run computers, we're still having to modify and adapt. They run with strict rules generally, because if you break the rule, you get a long error message. To the degree that I think, as this applies, let's say, to the teaching of language, one of the things is to, of course, help somebody to know what those rules are. And those rules are not rules that are hard and fast. They're not like physical laws. Those rules are, as I like to say, cultural convention. They're just that we have agreed over a period of time that this is the way something is done within a given context. And that context is political and social and linguistic and, you know, disciplinary in the sense of applies to whatever field it's relating to. And that you want people to be aware of them. But, you know, one of the things I always do with my students is go, okay, so let's start, you tell me what good writing is. You're going to go and you're going to evaluate writing. Okay, so tell me what a good piece of writing is. And people launch in with a kind of enthusiasm I love. And that we get going and we write all this stuff down, and in the end we wind up going, I can't do this. It's impossible. I don't know what a good piece of writing is. I know it when I see it, but it also depends on the context, on me, on who's reading it. So all of a sudden what we do know, though, is that certain pieces of writing stand out for us. Sometimes it is the writing that makes the rules that stands out. Sometimes, though, especially from the level of as we learn, what we do is we get to the place where we're comfortable enough to bend the rule. And the reader is always alerted when something unusual happens that is coherent with in a rule but bends it, so that we encounter that same idea if you're, you know, going to read a textbook. Again, what does the topic sentence do? And there's formats for that. You know, they follow general patterns and trends. You know, biology is the study of, and you know, living organisms, let's say. And I can go through and go, well, you know, along that, you would, if you were teaching that, you would have to know a whole lot of stuff. Like one, when do you have a general noun, an abstract noun that is not preceded by an article? Why is it not the biology? Let me tell you, most ESL students, when acquired, would want to put the biology, and it would make sense to say the biology. You know, the study of organisms. That is a very particular kind of expression that we show the relationship between conceptual wholes. Those need to be understood. Now you can switch that, for example, so that the organisms study, which is a weird way of phrasing that. Your native speaker ear twists, but a part of a partitive expression is being able to show a possessive. It's the reversal of it. And in many instances that work. That's to say that those are conventions I'm talking about. I'm just taking a kind of generic introduction to a formal piece of text in a field like biology and saying there's all these options that are presented to the sophisticated writer. To be able to really play with them, you have to know when that is severely departing from what you want your audience to get. So if what you want to do is to really explain something clearly to your audience, that becomes a kind of constraint to your writing activity. But you also want to know when it's okay to make those inversions and what kind of rule breaking fits that particular, you know, conventional pattern in language. And so, you know, I'm kind of answering your general question with a real specific, but I think that to answer that, no, I'm not one of the traditional grammarians who would suggest to you that language is composed of a series of autonomous rules and a static lexical set. Yes, dead languages, that's true, because there's no more, I mean, there are people who livingly speak it, but they're not in a position of changing it. They acquire a completed form, and then they're either right or wrong. So you can say, okay, that's a sealed set. You take a language like English, as young as it is, it's such a new language, as broad-based, so that if you just take Canada and you go from Newfoundland to BC, you encounter countless Englishes along the way. And I mean, there you go, I've just broken a rule. How come I've pluralized the word English? But we see that happening. You know, we have need of this change, and the need is social, because we need to say certain things. We need to recognize that we're no longer dealing with, even in this term, a monolith. And that change is rapid all the time. So much so that even things that seem to have already really gained status in the language, still, you know, like I frequently type the word literacies and see my little squiggly line come up under it. And now that term has been in vogue probably going on 20 years. So, you know, even things like spell check are slow to be able to keep up with the rapid pace of change. And so I think what's more important, you know, than laying out the rules, because if you look at even English grammar rules, a lot of it is heavily based on Latin. You know, so there's a few changes, but that's an odd connection. Yes, we did borrow a lot of Latin roots, but as many, certainly French and German and what have you, and now just about everything. It's kind of a mongrel. It gobbles up absolutely anything it can find. So, you know, and only, what, 2.5 years ago during the summer, we passed the 1 million unique words in English stage, which is enormous. Who can learn 1 million words? You know, I have some I'd like to add to that as well, just for the pure pleasure of making up my own words.
All of them with the meanings?
Yes, I'll add the meanings too, I promise. I'll get them into Urban Dictionary one way or the other. So I think the key is, I don't think you can't, when you're teaching English, often your student wants the rule. They just want to know how it works. They do not want you to go, well, in this instance like this, but not here, and sometimes here. It's so frustrating. You want a clear set, and then you can only resort to the fact, well, and I'm saying that now, and tomorrow that rule might have changed. You know, that in fact pop culture has a huge sway on language dynamics. as I used that example of the text messaging. You know, you're still functioning within, among two speakers, let's say, of English, you still have recognition. They know what each other are texting back and forth, but if you handed it in to some kind of spell check, you would get nowhere. And that's part of the point, I'm sure, the joy of that. You know, I often like to think of an example of Hawaiian. There's a Hawaiian Creole that occurred because we brought a lot of people, a lot of planters and what have you, brought in. They encountered an English environment, and the kids grew up speaking, you know, half of their native tongue, half of English, and they blended it into a pidgin. And a whole language that is currently used today evolved in the space of one generation. You know, half of the speakers probably knew each other. You know what I mean? Like, and so language has that capacity to foment very quickly within a social sphere. For it to develop into convention, i.e. where the rules come from, it takes time. Some things, I sometimes use the example, just to take another film. You remember when Borat came out, Sacha Baron Cohen's movie. And he does this thing where he is making fun of a ESL speech pattern. So he's trying to learn sarcasm. And he says, "This suit is black, not." And the idea is you'll wait. And for a little while, because it seemed silly, I heard a lot of people using that. I even remember having the thought at the time, oh, geez, I hope this doesn't become like typical conventional mode of expression. Sure enough, it didn't have much purchase. About 6 months later, I never heard it again.
What about the phrase "me back"?
Yeah,
That one was
yeah, there you go. One of the ones that I've often, you know, and this is keeping an open mind too, right? This is really about keeping an open mind. For the longest time, although I'm not a purist, I love language change, I just couldn't get to the word, "we've had a disconnect." The noun version of that word was flipping me out. And I was encountering it every day. I would have people on the bus, in lecture halls, wherever. There's been a disconnect. This is a disconnect. And I was like, wow, how and when did that happen? You know? Now I've noticed it's going out of vogue only because there's some new ones moving in that have taken that one's place. But I think we can anticipate that a part of the rule basis is if enough people agree, we can take any old verb and make it a noun. Right? So right now we think of reaction, you know, so soon we'll be able to have a react. I had to react to that comment you made. That question, I had to react to that, you know.